for Chapter 24, The Nation at War. Despite the genuine desires of President Wilson and the American people to remain out of the First World War, the United States entered the war in April 1917. This chapter traces America's increasing involvement in world affairs before 1917, explains why the United States finally entered the war, and discusses some of the consequences of that involvement. A new world power. American foreign policy since the late 19th century had been aggressive and nationalistic. As a colonial power with increasingly valuable investments outside the country, the United States became more and more involved in international affairs. Americans' domination of the Caribbean was illustrated when the United States decided to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, which at that time belonged to Colombia. When the Colombian Senate refused to allow the canal in 1903, Roosevelt encouraged an abetted revolution that separated Panama from Colombia. The new nation agreed to let the canal construction proceed, and it was opened in 1914. The Roosevelt Corollary. Except for the Virgin Islands purchased in 1917, the United States did not acquire territory in the Caribbean, but the United States did treat Latin America as a protectorate. After several nations defaulted in their international debt, thus provoking European reprisals, Roosevelt announced that the United States would intervene to ensure the stability and solvency of Latin American nations, in accordance with his Roosevelt Corollary. And this was a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The United States intervened in the Dominican Republic, Panama, and in Cuba. Ventures in the Far East. Under Roosevelt, the United States and Japan worked out several agreements that put Korea in the Japanese sphere of influence, but kept Japan from interfering in the Philippines. Eventually, however, Japan resented the open-door policy in China and began to demand special rights for herself. Taft and dollar diplomacy. Taft tried to substitute economic force for military power in American diplomacy. In the Caribbean, this generally worked, and American bankers replaced Europeans in that area. In the Far East, Taft's support for American economic influence in Manchuria alienated China, Japan, and Russia. Foreign policy under Wilson. Wilson had little experience or knowledge of diplomacy, but felt that he could conduct a foreign policy based on a moral force. Conducting moral diplomacy. Wilson achieved some success in moral diplomacy, but when faced with crisis in Latin America, he too sent in the Marines. Troubles across the border. Wilson's tendency towards moral self-righteousness showed itself when he refused to recognize the government of Mexico in 1913 because it was headed by a man Wilson considered a murderer. When Wilson tried to use the U.S. Navy to block arms shipments to Mexico, several incidents ensued, resulting in the bombing and seizing of Veracruz by the United States. Although Wilson backed down after that, he ordered the U.S. Army into Mexico in 1916 in pursuit of a guerrilla and bandit Pancho Villa. Toward war. The European system of alliances marched two great blocks into the war of World War I. The Central Powers, headed by Germany, faced the Allied powers, headed by England and France. Although his sympathies laid with England, Wilson hoped the United States could remain at peace. The neutrality policy. There were several reasons for the strong force of neutrality in America. Progressives considered war wasteful and irrational and suspected that big business instigated the conflict for profits. Immigrants generally preferred that the United States remain neutral, lest it come in on the wrong side. America always believed that they had a long tradition of neutrality and saw no reason to intervene. Freedom of the seas. The United States experienced immediate violations of its neutral right to trade with Germany, despite a blockade by English Navy. Wilson persisted, but accepted England's promise to reimburse American shippers when the war was over. The U-boat threat. Germany's use of submarines in reprisal for England's naval blockade caused the greatest difficulty for Wilson's diplomacy. Since submarines had to shoot without warning, they violated international law. When Americans were killed or injured in these attacks, most notably the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, Wilson protested and finally issued an ultimatum in April of 1916. At that time, Germany backed down and pledged to honor Americans' right as a neutral country. He kept us out of war. Wilson planned to run for re-election on the theme of Americanism and preparedness, but discovered that his claim to have kept the nation out of war created greater enthusiasm. Women's voting in 12 states went heavily for Wilson. Nonetheless, the election was close. Wilson won by only about 500,000 votes in the total of almost 18 million cast. The final months of peace. Wilson moved to mediate the European conflict, but by the beginning of 1917, Germany was confident that she could win through a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare against England and all ships sailing to England. In reply, Wilson ordered American merchant vessels to arm themselves and ordered the U.S. Navy to fire on German submarines. In March, after U-boats sank 5 American ships, Wilson decided on war. On April 2, 1917, he had asked for a declaration of war, and Congress, applauding, gave its consent. Over there, the United States entered the war when Germany was on the verge of victory. This section describes Americans' contribution to the Allied victory. The United States had prepared no contingency plan for military effort in Europe. There were only 200,000 soldiers in the army, but Wilson promptly instituted a draft that eventually called over 2 million men into military service. The war in the trenches. The American and English navies teamed up to cut Allied losses in submarines in half. By June of 1917, American troops began arriving in France, and by the next spring and summer, American forces were strong enough to help halt the final German offensive. In September, the Americans pushed the Germans out of Saint Michel and added a tremendous punch to the Allied attack that led the Germans to ask for peace. Over here, President Wilson moved to enlist the hearts and minds of the entire population in the war effort. The war began with an outpouring of rage against Germany that Wilson encouraged and used to have Congress pass the Sedition Act. Any criticism of the war was penalized, and dissenters like Eugene Debs were in prison. Later, fear of worldwide communist revolution led Wilson to send American troops into Russia to prevent the Bolsheviks from consolidating power. The crusade against communism gathered such momentum that radicals were rounded up and expelled from the country even after the war ended. The bureaucratic war. The war led to efficient government control of the economy. Various agencies, usually headed by business people, supervised all aspects of production and distribution to ensure a maximum war effort. In some cases,